Hey, I'm Crompwell, and today we're going to look at an intro to 3D photogrammetry. For those of you who have had me in class, this will be a bit of a refresher for you. And for those of you who haven't, hopefully this will just be useful information. This is going to be a multi part series that I will compile into a playlist. And so, in this first part, we're just going to be talking in terms of lecture, defining photogrammetry, looking at some of the best practices in order to approach doing a project of our own. And then later, we'll see some examples along with the software. And I'll walk you through a short bit of looking at the software and some of the things that we'll do after in order to process the 3D model that we get out of photogrammetry. So, for those of you that don't know, the shortest definition I could find for photogrammetry is the use of photography in surveying and mapping distances between objects. So, essentially, what we're talking about here is we're getting a camera or some sort of scanning device, we're capturing 2D images of an object or a surface, we're processing those through software, and we're generating 3D objects that can either be printed, uploaded online, or used in some sort of application. And we'll look at some of those applications now. So, some of the use cases that I put together are archival, surveying, and entertainment. And I should have also added medical. It wasn't something I was thinking about at the time because it wasn't so obvious. But a really cool story that I heard recently that came out of a Blender conference was that Blender and 3D photo scanning was used in order to capture the surface of a football player. So that's European football. To us Americans, that's soccer. So a football player's face, because he had some sort of concussion or some sort of injury, and he needed a mask created in order to help speed up his recovery. Now, traditionally, the way that would have been done is there would have needed to be a physical casting of the surface of his face and then a reconstruction of that casting into the mask that would go over it. However, that was a bit invasive. His face was either some sort of sensitive injury where they didn't want to be intrusive and interact with the surface of his face. So instead, they were able to capture the surface of his face using photogrammetry, edit it slightly in the computer, and generate that mask without ever having to physically interact with his face, which was really cool to see. So, medical is another example of photogrammetry use that is up and coming. But in this case, the kind of historical uses that we've seen so far are archival. So we're preserving historical objects or landmarks, documenting them, and making sure that time does not necessarily erode away or destroy things that would otherwise be lost to us if we weren't able to preserve them in 3D or through scanning. So that's one really prominent use of it today. We also have surveying, so topological mapping and site assessment. So for architects, they can go out and they can use a drone to kind of scan and assess perhaps a swath of land and see how it might look with a building that they're trying to design there. They could probably mock that up in 3D, and then they could look at all the data that they've gathered from that and see what sort of engineering issues they might run into in order to mitigate any risk associated with building a building in that area. Other uses I've seen in the surveying category, as I'm calling it, some places will do site scouting using photogrammetry. So a company might be able to go out and use a drone to scan an area and get an idea if that area is appropriate for their building or their location. Or, for example, I've seen businesses that will actually scan the inside of their buildings, such as hotels and venues, and allow people to view those inside 3D and see if those people would like to use their facilities without having to travel far distances in order to site scout that. So that's another very common use of 3D photogrammetry mixed with virtual reality that I've seen in recent days. Another good example of the use of photogrammetry is the entertainment industry. Photogrammetry is great for capturing high density areas of detail that mimic reality, that are very accurate to reality, which is in stark contrast to creating things from scratch in 3D, which can often look machined, kind of sterile, maybe a little too perfect. And so capturing some of that kind of realistic surface detail that would be difficult to create in 3D is easy to do with photogrammetry, and it's great for creating static meshes. In other words, meshes that don't move or deform or otherwise need to animate. It's also good for capturing reference data like the likeness of an actor. So, another recent example that was seen was in Star Wars Rogue One, where the actor who portrayed Grand Moff Tarkin, pictured here, and this is done by Industrial Light and Magic, taken from No Film School. Basically, what they had was they had a bust of this actor created during his lifetime before he died, which he unfortunately is no longer with us, that they could use in order to scan and also reference to create the 3D likeness of him and cast it onto the actor who was portraying that character for the film, and it brought him back to life. Now, some people argue that it kind of crosses into the uncanny valley, but nonetheless, it was very impressive to see that at such a high level of detail in a major motion picture. So we're definitely seeing more and more of that, and that's in both games and film. So definitely a lot of applications in the entertainment industry for photogrammetry. Moving along, I've included some examples. So we have the video game The Vanishing of Ethan Carter here in the upper left. And this was a game that I've seen many articles praising its use of photogrammetry in order to create very believable and beautiful environments. You can see we've got some rocks here, a bunch of foliage, perhaps some twigs and sticks and things here, as well as trees. And photogrammetry is great for creating that static land detail that's not going to be moving very much to create very rich and engaging environments for video games and films. Another example here that we can see in the upper right is that someone probably flew a drone over what looks to be some sort of industrial land management. And I don't know if this was for archival purposes or for what, but you can see they flew a drone over, and each of these blue squares kind of represents the angle at which the photo was taken. And then they recreated the landscape in 3D. So we can get very large projects that are scanned with images and create some pretty cool 3D representations of that based on that data. Another image that I want to draw your attention to is in the lower right hand corner. We have either a light field or a light stage. I've seen people call this many different things, but essentially, this is a very high end, high budget photogrammetry setup that you'll see in more professional setups or companies that own these. You can actually go to some of these companies and rent them for a certain amount of time, for a certain amount of money, and actually have yourself or some object or something scanned. This is probably better for living creatures like human beings and animals because you have all of these digital SLRs that are all pointed at the subject with some tracking data on the floor, or tracking information on the floor, I should say. And so they can actually simultaneously take all of those photos from around the subject all at once, reducing the risk that the object or the person or the thing is moving, creating a problem with reconstructing it in 3D. So again, this is a very high-end setup that you'll see at big companies. You can also see that they have a light control here, that they're bouncing light off of the white walls in the room, and that's what you can expect to see at higher budget places. Now in the lower left-hand corner, we've got Baby Groot sitting down here from the Guardians of the Galaxy films there. But essentially, this is closer to what we're going to be looking at doing in our case. We're going to be taking images from various angles around our object and reconstructing that object in 3D. So this is more the consumer grade version of photogrammetry. It's in our case, we can do it completely for free so long as we have the appropriate hardware, and that's what we'll be looking at. So moving on, the resources that we're going to be needing for this are basically a digital camera and software. That's really all we need in order to accomplish our goals. If you'd like to 3D print your object afterwards, then add that to the list. But for our cases, if you wanted to upload these online, this is all you need. So if you have your own personal camera, use that. If you have a decent camera phone, you're more than welcome to use that. I know a lot of people use their iPhones for photo scanning or photogrammetry. And if you're one of the students from University of Rochester, you can borrow a camera from Retner or from Sage. Those are the two places that I know that are listed that you can borrow cameras from. And then if you have a personal drone, you're more than welcome to use that as well. I haven't yet had the opportunity to try this out myself. I would love to, but if you have your own, feel free. Software. Adobe Creative Cloud is industry standard for image processing, so of course I had to add that to the list. The the photogrammetry software that we're going to be looking at, and I will be showcasing in either the next video or the one after that, is Meshroom. And this is what's going to be processing our photos into a 3D model. Then we have Blender, which is what we're going to be editing our 3D model in. Now, I want to make a note, Meshroom and Blender are both free and open source, so you don't have to pay anything for them. You simply download them and use them, which is fantastic. And then any other image editing software or 3D software that you're comfortable and familiar with, by all means, you're more than welcome to use them. So there's that. Next up, we have selecting a subject, which is a very important topic to talk about in regards to photogrammetry. The size of the subject can range from something small and handheld to the size of an entire building. It's completely up to you to determine what object you want to use, but you can do anything in that range. I would say anything bigger than a building would be pretty hard to capture unless you've got a space shuttle. So good luck with that. Um, all jokes aside, the material is also really important. Transparent and reflective materials are not good for photogrammetry. The reason being that photogrammetry software is what it does is it tracks the pixels and the movement of pixels, and it tries to recreate an object based on how much those pixels move. So, as you can imagine, with a glass object or a transparent object or a very reflective object, you're going to be seeing the bending of light, so the refraction of light through objects, or the reflection of objects that are not necessarily there. And the photo scanning software may pick up on that and it may cause errors within the process of creating that object. So, you can see here in the bottom right corner from 1024, the 3D Scan Store, if you want to search that up. They have a guide on how to do photogrammetry with glass objects or transparent objects, and what they've done is they've coated this with I believe it's a photogrammetry paint. Yes, those exist. So you can get paint for photogrammetry to cover your object and then scan it, and then it's removable, or some of them are removable. I would look into it first before purchasing that if you want to go hardcore into photogrammetry. But essentially, you want to coat this with some sort of paint that makes it matte, and then they've added all of these paint flecks in order to better help the software see the contours of the object. So this is something that needs to be done if you want to capture a transparent object. And then if you want to make it transparent later on, that can be done in the 3D software of your choice. But some things to avoid are transparent plastic objects, glass, mirrors, windows, chrome, very shiny and metallic objects that reflect things very easily. Those sorts of things you kind of want to avoid when doing photogrammetry. And one thing that I want to make a note of is both of these pictures were obviously taken with some sort of flash photography. We're not going to do that. They did that in order to show off the object, but I can almost guarantee that these are not the photos that they used when it came to the reconstruction process. I just want to make a note of that so nobody gets confused. So carrying on, let's talk about capture method. Now, both of these images come from 3dflow.net, and they are in relation to 3DF Zephyr, which is another piece of photogrammetry software. I'll talk about that briefly when we get to the software part, as I offer alternatives to Meshroom if that's something you're looking into. But essentially, once your subject has been selected, you need to figure out which way you're going to capture it. And the kind of dichotomy that I've sorted here is that you can capture small objects a certain way and large objects a certain way. Um, so the small object in this instance might be that glass bowl from the previous slide, or it might be an entire building or a wall or some sort of edifice that you might want to capture. So the kind of suggested rule of thumb here is that we're going to frame our object in the center. Obviously, that's going to be a little bit easier with an edifice than with a small object, but you frame your object in the center of your shot, and then you take multiple photos from various angles around the object with about 70 to 80% of the photo's details overlapping with the previous photo. Um, so you can see here that you start at one angle and then you might move a little bit over here, making sure that there's plenty of overlap between the shots. And you continue doing that all the way around the object until you've captured as much detail or as much data as you need in order to recreate that object. We'll talk a little bit more about lighting conditions and the number of photos and things like this. But for now, I'm just going to detail the basic kind of structure for capturing in terms of how we move the camera and things like this. So the subject should be the focus of each of your shot. It's kind of obvious to say that. And it's always best to maintain even spacing between each of the shots if that's at all possible. As long as you have enough overlap, it should be okay. So the difference between the small object and the large object is obviously that sometimes with the large object or edifice, you're going to be going parallel to it because you can't really get around it necessarily like you can with a small object. So here we have the example of shooting photos in parallel to the object, and we've got quite a bit of overlap here. I would even argue that if you can get more overlap than just this, that would be better. But for the most part, this seems to capture a good amount of the surface quality there. I can see how if these end photos here weren't of the best quality, we might lose some of the data in there. But here, where we've got all this red overlap, that's going to be a really detailed area. And perhaps that's exactly what we want to capture on our object. So just keep in mind that the size of your subject is kind of going to alter exactly how you go about capturing it. And then here's another quick example again from 1024 detailing that glass bowl. You can see that from the top, they've gone all the way around the object, and from the side, they've gone up and down. Now, it might be difficult to capture underneath your object, and I would not worry about that. So maybe these two cameras underneath here you can ignore and just take a shot from the front and then all the way up. If you're someone who has a good control over your environment and the lighting, you might be able to get away with a very clean piece of glass underneath here and get underneath it and shoot it as long as you don't have any reflections or any strange caustics that are being casted by the light passing through the glass. So that is probably one way to do it, but again, be very careful about doing it if that's how you choose to go about it. Again, I would suggest that if you're beginning, don't worry about it. Just start with a front on shot and get the upper shot, and then just go all the way around it. So if you can imagine all of these kind of being done at each of these steps, that would probably be a very good way to document this object and have enough photos in order to recreate it in 3D. So, photography practices when it comes to doing photogrammetry. So, we obviously need very stable and well focused images. Anything that's blurry, anything that's shaky is only going to serve to diminish the quality of our reconstruction. And so, those should be discarded. If at all possible, use a tripod. Make sure that your camera is still. It's also suggested that you have a deep depth of field for photogrammetry. So even though it might seem like here on the left having a shallow depth of field might be more useful because the object kind of stands out more, it's actually suggested that having a deep depth of field where everything in the image is in focus actually gives us more data to work with because the software is not like you and I where we can tell the difference between a foreground object and a background object. What it's actually doing is looking at the pixels in the scene and seeing how much they move. Now, obviously, pixels on the object we're focusing on are closer to the camera, and they are going to remain relatively more stationary than the pixels in the background. And so, when the software goes to reconstruct the motion from those pixels and that data, it's going to be able to tell, okay, this is closer to the camera, and this is more than likely what they're trying to capture. Whereas here, we have more ambiguous pixels in the background because everything's being blurred, and it might actually be harder for the software to reconstruct that in 3D space. So keeping a deep depth of field somewhere between f8 and f16 might be helpful. And what that means is that if we have a higher aperture value of f8 or f16, that might also mean that we need a longer exposure, thus resulting in shakiness if we're not using a tripod. So again, use a tripod if at all possible. Lighting conditions are also very important when it comes to capturing images for photogrammetry. Traditionally, we are taught to have good contrast that creates some nice balance in the photo. However, with photogrammetry, we want to keep our contrast low in order to preserve as much surface detail as possible. So, what I mean by that is we don't want to be taking photos of an object in a setting where light is casting dark shadows that occlude detail or that cast bright highlights that kind of blow out areas of detail on the surface. So, for example, what I can make out of here is you can see that we have some dark shadows on this image here, and some of this data might get lost. And then we have some really bright highlights on the surface of this lacrosse stick here, where some of that data might be lost. So overall, this isn't a bad image. It's got all of the detail that we might need. You can see some of the lacing here getting lost in the background, which might be a problem. So keeping everything as evenly lit with as clear and understandable data as possible is going to be better for you. So avoid situations where the subject is washed out or hidden in shadow, and avoid flash photography because it creates dark shadows and bright highlights. Unless, of course, you are very experienced with lighting setups and understand how to do this, maybe using a diffuser or some bounce cards or something like that in order to really control your lighting situation. I would highly try to dissuade anyone from using flash photography when trying to capture images for photogrammetry. Moving on, we have some general guidelines. Now, these are general guidelines, as the slide titles. The thing about this is these rules can kind of be bent depending on what you need. They're not hard and fast, but they are general. These were taken from 3dflow.net, which is, again, the people who manufacture the Zephyr software we'll look at later if you're interested in using an alternative to Mushroom. So, general guidelines are keep the subject in the center of the framing. So, clearly, we want to make sure that our subject is framed properly, avoid direct light sources that can cast shadows or hide surface areas. Another really good thing to point out is avoid high ISOs. Again, I mentioned using higher aperture value so that way we can get a deeper depth of field. And doing so may require that we keep the shutter open longer. Now, some people may be tempted to supplement this with a very high ISO setting on the camera. The problem with this is that high ISO settings can generate large amounts of noise, and that's not going to be consistent across each photo, which can generate pixels that can confuse our reconstruction software. So be very careful about balancing your high ISO. Again, use a tripod and calibrate your settings ahead of time. Do some test shots before you really get into shooting your subject, and make sure all of your shots are coming out crisp and clear. Again, that keeping a high aperture value of between f8 and f16 is really helpful to get a deep depth of field, and avoiding blurry photos, of course, using a good quality camera and having a good lighting setup is very important. And again, I'm going to stress, use a tripod if possible. A little note about the kind of camera that you want. Cameras that allow full light management are sometimes better than cameras that just cram as many megapixels into the image resolution as possible. Of course, you want to have a camera that has good resolution and that captures a good resolution. I think for Mushroom, it's recommended that we have an image that's at least 5 megapixels. So it's definitely useful to have more data, but it's suggested that full frame reflex sensor cameras are preferable. Again, those can be very expensive, ranging in the thousands of dollars. So you might not have access to a camera like that. But if you're someone who is really interested in doing photography and getting into photogrammetry, it's definitely suggested. There is also some talk about the size of sensors within a camera. Now, I'm not too familiar with that, but it's something about 1 to 2 and 2.3-inch sensors or larger are suggested. Most cameras should do that, I believe. A lot of them are maybe like 2.5 inches or larger. Again, I'm not too familiar with that. Um, but if you have a decent sized camera with a good sensor in it, it should more or less work. Again, this can be done with a camera phone. There are some really good photogrammetry projects that come out of a camera phone. So I wouldn't stress too much about your hardware unless you're really, really looking into getting into this professionally. Another good rule of thumb moving on is having lots of overlap on each of your photos. Somewhere between 70 to 80% of the photo detail should be overlapping between the photos that you take. Shoot as many photos as necessary. Each part of the scene shot should appear in at least 3 separate views taken from different locations. Now, again, this is not hard and fast rule, but it is suggested. People say that that's the minimum requirement. I'm not going to place that on anyone, but taking more photos will likely improve the final results. And the kind of rule that I would place on this is no less than 35 photos. I've gotten away with doing about 30 to 33, and it's resulted in an acceptable 3D model. But of course, the more you can do, the better. I would say in the range of 50 to 70 in terms of what we're looking at for our course. Definitely would work for what we're aiming to achieve, but I've definitely seen photogrammetry projects done in the hundreds of photos, and the reason I wouldn't suggest that for this is that it's going to take much longer to process all of those photos. The more photos you have, the longer the processing time. So kind of balance that. Have enough photos for decent quality, good quality, but don't do so many that it's going to take you forever. And it is sometimes the case that if you have more photos that are not necessarily processed the best, it can sometimes diminish the quality. So make sure you pick the highest quality photos and kind of balance that somewhere maybe in the 50 to 70 range. Limit the angles between photos. Now, some students approached me about this and said, "Oh, does this mean the angle at which I shoot it from above or below?" And the answer is no, not really. What I mean by this is if you're going to take a photo of the subject, and I'll go back really quickly to show this. The angle, what I mean by angle is, or what the article meant by angle, is if you drew a line from here to the subject and then one from here from this next shot, the angle between these two shots should be relatively small. So as you can imagine, if you shot from here and then immediately went over here, you're going to miss a lot of data in the middle. So that's what I mean by a small angle. So let's move back to this. So limiting the angle between the photos, just make sure that you are having enough overlap when moving around your objects and keep that angle low is what I meant by that. So that can also include as you move up above the subject or below it, just make sure that you're taking enough photos with enough overlap. That's really all it is. Shoot scenes with lots of detail and textures. The visual texture in the photos is what ties them together. Again, I'm going to go back and reference this image here. You can see that there's a lot of texture here, but it would be hard for the software to make sense of it. And so creating our own artificial texture that better details the surface of the object is beneficial. So you can definitely do that if necessary. There are photogrammetry paints if you really want to go into photogrammetry professionally. You're more than welcome to search those out and use them. Again, it's not something I would require for this course, but it is there if you're curious. And then lastly, don't try to adjust lens distortion. That error in the camera is actually really important in the phase of structuring, creating the structure from motion. And so that's something that we definitely want to leave in our images. Do not try to remove that. And then the last thing I'll talk about in this presentation is image correction. So temperature or white balance should be set in your camera before you go to capture all of your images. Make sure that it's as consistent as possible. Now this here was an image that I did where I actually uncorrected it, I suppose. I made it look erroneous when really both of these were actually captured with the proper temperature that I wanted. And you can see that I use color balance to do that. I would say that fixing things in post, try to keep that to a minimum because the chance for error is a little bit greater when you do that. Make sure that everything is as consistent as possible. But I would say that as a last resort, you may go ahead and use color correction to try to get your photos as close to each other as possible. And you can do that visually, or you can sample the colors inside of Photoshop, whatever you need to do. Blurriness and loss of data. However, if you have any shaky or blurry photos, simply discard them. They will not serve you in the reconstruction at all. And you will only have a diminishment in quality if you attempt to use them. So that's definitely something that I would dissuade anyone from trying to use, or blurry photos or shaky photos. Just get rid of them. And then lastly, don't use content aware fill or other algorithms that kind of artificially place in pixels. It may look good to your eye. However, the software is going to be trying to track pixels consistently across photos. And so if you're artificially creating pixels, it could lead to a lot of problems. Um, Again, I'm not going to make this a hard and fast sort of thing. If you want to try it, do so at your own peril. However, I would again try to dissuade someone from doing that. Um, it may be difficult to recreate the conditions and the position and the lighting of your shoot, should you need to do it again. So I would highly suggest taking the time and setting up your settings, using a tripod, making sure you have a good control of your lighting, making sure that you are not shooting in a very high contrast light. So that means that if you wanted to shoot outdoors, make sure it's on a cloudy or overcast day, or you shoot your subject in the shadow of another object in order to maintain the even lighting around the object. And make sure that you capture everything you need in your shoot. Otherwise, you may have to redo your shoot, and I would not like to see that for anyone. It would be a pain, and I hope that everybody can get all the data that they need in order to accomplish their goals. So that's basically my short presentation on the process of capturing images for photogrammetry. In the next series of videos, we'll look at some examples that I've created and some of the conditions around that, as well as the actual software for Meshroom itself. And if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments. And I'd like to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. And I hope everybody comes out with a great project and learns something. All right, take care.